Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior professional from Manchester, UK, Mr. Richard Betts. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Ashutosh. Great to be here.
Thank you. Richard is a partner of climate change and sustainability services with Ernst & Young, or EY. So, Richard, just before we started recording, we were talking about strange climate positions. I'm in India and we've had a very severe winter. But before we get into climate change, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Great. Yeah, sure. So I first got into climate change and sustainability at university. So I studied environmental sciences, both undergrad and masters in the UK, and both had a big focus on climate change. I mean, that was sort of over 20 years ago, so things were a little bit different then. But there was a big focus on looking to the past, looking to sort of try and understand past changes in Earth's history, previous cold and warm periods, in order to sort of have some better evidence to understand how the planet could respond now with contemporary human-induced climate change. So that's how it started. And then when I decided not to stay in academia and do a PhD, I switched. I had a rethink, and I went into consulting. I've been with the Big Four ever since, and since 2010, I've been in sustainability, climate change. A lot of years in the UK, and I also had 8 years based in Istanbul, in Turkey, and then back in the UK for the last year and a half.
Amazing. So let me start by asking you something that you're probably asked all the time. What are some of the challenges we face when we talk about climate change?
Yeah, well, climate change affects everything. We all rely on a stable climate, and the science is really clear that human activities are warming our planet through fossil fuel combustion, wide-scale deforestation, and so on. We're currently putting around sort of 50 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. And our modern economy and civilization are driving global warming of the planet. And all sectors, companies, and individuals, we're all contributing to this problem. But the science is also clear that we already have most of the solutions. We need to decarbonize our global economy by mid-century at the very latest. That means decarbonizing all sectors. Some already have clearer decarbonization pathways, where the solutions are increasingly widely available and cost effective, e.g. Wind and solar in the power sector, but then there are other sectors and areas where zero carbon solutions are not yet sort of widely available, or are still prohibitively expensive. Think aviation, or some of the heavy manufacturing industries like cement. So really, as I said, it affects everything, and given the scale of the challenge and the sort of urgency of acting, these do present unprecedented challenges.
Well said. And how receptive are the large corporations about climate change?
I think there's always a spectrum. There's a bell curve, and I think there'll always be a few large companies that sort of are pioneers, and that sort of look to act ahead of the others, and well before there's a legal requirement. Then more companies decide to act when they see the sector leader acting, and then there are a lot of companies that will probably wait for a legal requirement to act. So I think when we think of climate change, the pioneers have started to act. Many other companies have followed. Then there's been increasingly lots of different sort of legislation in different countries and areas, not just climate change, but other sort of sustainability areas. But the bar's going up rapidly. There are new initiatives, the data is improving, the scientific understanding is improving. And so even companies that have been active for a long time, they still need to do a lot due to these changes and due to the scale of the challenges.
And, I was reading an article and Bill Gates recently commented that we only have 10 more years left. I'd love to get your perspective on what would happen if the world does not achieve its goals.
Well, I'm not sure of the sort of full context as to what Bill Gates said, although I have read quite a lot of things that he said in the past. But climate science is really clear that to avoid the worst effects of climate change, not only do we need to reach net zero globally by mid-century at the very latest, but we also need to slash emissions globally this decade by about 50%, because scientists have estimated our remaining carbon budget, the maximum amount of emissions that can be released if global warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. And without rapid reductions, the world will use up its carbon budget within the next 10 years.
Wow.
And then, as I touched on earlier, there are sort of some sectors and technologies, again, things like aviation, some of the heavy manufacturing industries, where, at the moment, there are not zero carbon solutions that are widely available. Yes, there are sort of very interesting ideas, initiatives, and sort of prototypes, but they're at an early stage of maturity. And so there's going to be need a lot of investment to sort of then make so that they can be widely available in the coming years. And really that, that investment, that sort of accelerating the research, that all needs to sort of happen now.
Interesting. My next question to you, Richard, is about the pandemic. And while we've all come out of the pandemic and there have been lots of suffering all over the world, it's often said that one of the positive aspects of the pandemic was that it gave a planet time for the planet to heal herself, and that everything seemed to have been sorted out, Mother Nature took control of a lot of the parameters. I'd love to get your perspective on, can the Earth heal itself?
Yes, I think it's amazing how, in many cases, how quickly nature can rebound. I mean, as you said, in terms of the pandemic and lockdown, obviously they were incredibly difficult times for people the world over. It was a really terrible time. But yes, there have been studies and analysis that have looked at sort of perhaps some of the sort of positive benefits, externalities from that very difficult time. So yes, when we think of lockdown, much of the world was under lockdown, and carbon emissions from certain sectors like transport plummeted, and this led to sort of big drops in air pollution, and there were lots of cases of nature starting to recover in certain areas, with animals being seen in cities, new areas that where they hadn't been seen for a very long time. So yeah, there were a few sort of positives there, but I think it's important to also put that in context, that apparently despite the huge restrictions of lockdown, global emissions only went down about 7%.
Oh, really? Okay.
In lockdown. I think that's quite astonishing. And the analysis shows us that we need to be sort of reducing our emissions globally by that sort of 7-8% every year this decade. So it really does sort of put the scale of the challenge into perspective, and how often people think about sort of transport when they think of sort of what to do about sort of reducing emissions. But I think it also shows us how we need to sort of tackle all sectors of the economy, because there are also articles, the last point on this, during lockdown, that it also meant that in many areas deforestation increased, and perhaps because there was less protection, with fewer people able to work in sort of in terms of protecting forest areas. emissions from deforestation went up, and deforestation's one of the largest contributors to emissions globally.
Yeah. And talking of deforestation, my next question to you is that I've often heard that climate change is a victim of politics. And I remember in the mid-90s when I used to live in Singapore, reading about the Brazil climate change conference, and the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Prime Minister Mahathir, actually said that the Western world seems to have used up all their forests for their economic development, and now they're asking Malaysia and Brazil to hold back on cutting their rainforests. I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, so I think there are a few points there, aren't there? I mean, in terms of the politics, I mean, I think yeah, I think it has been clear in recent years that climate change has become sort of increasingly politicized and polarized, at least in certain areas, in certain countries. But I really think that should not be the case, because obviously business and people everywhere, we all rely on a stable climate. Climate change affects us all, so this is everyone's problem. And these issues, they're systemic, they're interconnected, and so that also means we all have a role to play in contributing to the solutions. And so that might mean, if perhaps for people that are towards sort of the left-leaning end of the political spectrum, are likely to be more supportive of sort of strategies to sort of increase carbon taxes, more environmental legislation, more state intervention, whilst those at the other end of the spectrum are, should be able to get behind, other ideas around sort of more focus on innovation, on new technologies, on free market solutions, on sort of empowering the individual. So really, I would say, given the scale of the challenge, it shouldn't be an either or. We need a wide range of solutions given the scale of the challenge. So there's a role for everyone to play in this. And I think just lastly on your comment around Malaysia and Brazil, obviously what this also means is that it's important that emerging economies don't go through the same growth trajectory that developed countries like in Europe and North America went through. But the point is, with the improvement in technologies, renewable technologies, and so on, and with costs plummeting, increasingly there's no need for that to be the case.
Well said. Great response. Thank you. My next question is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. What can each one of us do to make ourselves more accountable to one another on the subject of climate change?
Yeah, so I think clearly it's important that we make ambitious commitments that we stick to. And so I think we can think of that in terms of both companies and individuals. So for companies, that means sort of, publishing ambitious targets for reducing emissions, reaching net zero, that are in line with the climate science, where they then sort of publish their plans for how they're going to reach those targets, and then achieving results in line with those published plans. And for companies, stakeholders, investors, customers, employees, and so on, to scrutinize the performance and to hold the company to account, and encourage it to sort of drive further improvement.
Interesting.
But then, as individuals, I was going to say, a lot we can do. We do live in a highly interconnected and networked world, and so we can reach a lot of people, not just family and friends, but sort of much larger spheres of influence through social media. So by raising awareness in terms of highlighting the solutions, the risks, holding each other to account, empowering each other, I think individuals can also have a big impact.
Fascinating. My next question is on technology. I mean, I know there's a lot of work going on how technology can be used to support climate change. I'd love to get a little bit of an overview from you on how technology is supporting climate change.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are lots of really exciting developments. I suppose it is important to first remember, of course, that a lot of conventional technologies have been accelerating the climate crisis. But in recent years, we've seen huge improvements in many technologies, lots of forms of clean tech that are starting to contribute to tackling climate change. We touched on sort of solar and wind before. So in the power sector, there have been huge improvements in not just the technology, but also in the reduction of costs as the economies of scale have picked up. Or if we look at road transport, we see EVs starting to increase rapidly in a lot of major markets. Then there are lots of technologies that are at very early stages of maturity still, but potentially could have a very big impact. Technologies around carbon removal technologies, I think potentially very interesting. Because up until this point, it's our nature-based solutions, our forests and oceans and peatlands and so on that have been removing a great deal of our carbon pollution, and our engineering solutions, notwithstanding all of our technological wizardry and ingenuity, the impact has been completely negligible. But going forward, it's likely and it's needed that those sort of engineering solutions for carbon removal will also become important.
Interesting. Let me now move to sustainability, Richard. And let me start by asking you that how seriously is sustainability being taken in boardrooms?
Yeah, so well, we've talked quite a lot about climate change. And of course, climate change is one of the important issues within sustainability, but obviously there are many others. So again, I think we see a spectrum of where companies are at in terms of the extent to which they're sort of prioritizing sustainability. And factors such as a company's sector, industry, where it operates, the regulatory landscape, its stakeholder expectations, they all can sort of strongly influence the level of board focus on sustainability and the priority issues. Up until now, this is as a generalization, we see many companies, many other stakeholders like regulators have really been taking a climate first approach. E.g. the one example, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, was set up towards the end of 2021 with the goal of establishing a set of global sustainability standards. And the first two standards, which are currently draft, focus on like this: one, the general principles, and two, climate change. And then there'll be other standards on other areas like biodiversity that are due to be developed in the next few years.
And one of the other questions that was often spoken about is that why is sustainability crucial for financial markets?
Well, I think to give an example, so every year the World Economic Forum publishes an annual risk report of the top risks to the global economy. They speak to experts around the world, and they publish the report. And in recent years, we've seen a big increase in environmental risks featuring in terms of the top risks to the global economy. And in the latest report, which was published recently, over the shortest time frame, 2 years, we have the cost of living crisis, which is top, but we also have several environmental risks, mainly sort of climate related risks as being amongst the top risks. And over a 10-year time horizon, 5 of the top 6 risks to the global economy were deemed to be environmental risks around climate change and biodiversity loss. So basically, environmental risk is now increasingly seen as a financial risk. And I think for any sort of mid to long term investment, such as sort of financial investments in sort of pension assets and so on, then sustainability factors are increasingly really critical.
Well said. And you give me a great response on why sustainability is crucial for financial markets. But conversely, it's often also said that from a national perspective, is an ambitious GDP growth plan contradictory to sustainability?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of discussion and lively debate in this area at present. A lot of commentators are starting to argue for degrowth and post-growth, arguing that we cannot continue to grow indefinitely on a planet with finite resources. So I think there is a lively debate, but I think it's certainly important that we consider what type of growth, and I think given the challenges we're facing, any growth now needs to be contributing to tackling these key issues, to improving people's lives and environment. So not growth at any cost. And I think it's also clear that in order to make the transition to net zero, to nature positive, to a more sustainable world, there is going to be a need for a huge growth in sustainable business in the coming years and decades. And so there's going to be a need for new and much larger industries globally in areas such as renewable energy, EVs, regenerative agriculture, carbon removal, solar foods, and so on. And then also for companies that manage to sort of transition their business models to more sustainable models. So I think certainly there is going to be a place still for growth in those sustainable areas, at least for the foreseeable future. But it shouldn't be sort of growth at any cost, and we should also be thinking about other indicators like well-being and quality of life.
Interesting. And my last question to you, Richard, and this is for the many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own amazing journey, as someone who has understood climate change so well, who's spoken about sustainability so much, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away on the subject of climate change?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, well, I think one point is we've been acting as if the environment, as if nature were no longer relevant or needed in our busy modern urban lives. So we've been ignoring nature. It's all seemed a bit sort of marginal, environment a bit marginal. But of course, nature is the foundation of all of our economy, prosperity, and civilization.
Correct.
Without healthy ecosystems and a stable climate, there wouldn't be an economy. So not external, not marginal, but the foundation. I think that's one point. And then 2 would be, as I touched on earlier, we're all stakeholders in planet Earth. We all have a role to play in helping to tackle these great issues: climate change, nature loss, to build a more sustainable world. And maybe finally, sustainability issues like climate change, nature loss, for me, they are the defining issues of our time. And green jobs and the solutions helping to tackle these issues are only going to grow rapidly in importance. And then, we're also seeing, in addition to those specialist sustainability jobs, we're also seeing the need to sort of integrate sort of sustainability principles into all jobs and sectors. And so this is something that everyone needs to be have an awareness of, and something that everyone can contribute to.
Very interesting. And on that note, and Richard, and your 3 amazing lessons, we've been taking nature for granted, but we must understand it is the foundation, so we can't afford to ignore nature. Second, we are all stakeholders in Mother Earth. Each one of us is responsible, and we've got to understand and accept our responsibility. And the third one you said is climate change is one of the key defining issues of our time. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your journey. Thank you for talking to me about climate change and taking us through so many different aspects of the challenges being faced and what are some of the solutions that we can work towards. Thank you also for speaking to me about sustainability. Thank you again, and good luck.
That's been my pleasure. Many thanks, Ashutosh. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.